Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a former multimedia journalist at KUSA Television in Denver, Colorado, and is the author of the historical fiction novel Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life, which is based on the real-life story of his grandfather. His name is Jack Maher, and here's my interview with Jack. Jack Maher, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is Jack Maher. I am a historical novelist, and my book is called Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. And it's about my grandfather, Eric Douglas, who helped start the Denver Art Museum.
Can you tell us more about your prior work at the KUSA TV Channel 9, the NBC affiliate in Denver, Colorado?
Absolutely. I was with the station for 34 years, and I was hired to start Denver's first real morning show, morning newscast. And it was a new concept back then, and they really put a lot of resources into it. I was very fortunate. We had a helicopter for traffic. We had, an overnight photographer, reporter. I was the producer. And because of the success of that early enterprise, we expanded it to an hour within about a year. And then by the time I retired, we were on two different TV stations doing 2.5 hours of broadcast, 4.5 hours every day. So it was amazing to see how that little show had grown over time. And along the way, I picked up 4 Emmys and several Colorado Broadcaster Awards. So I was very fortunate with my broadcasting career.
Without spoiling too much of your novel, Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life, what is it about?
Well, it is about this man, Eric Douglas, who was my grandfather. And he really started the Native Arts Department at the Denver Art Museum. And he and his father, Winfred Douglas, really were champions of Native creators. This was at a time in our country's history when a lot of the Native Americans were being, forced onto reservations, and their culture was being affected by the decisions made at the federal level. And so Winfred and Eric and others really were concerned that their art, their language would be forced out. And so they sort of took it upon themselves to try to document as much of this as possible, and then bring it to, the wider public through places like the Denver Art Museum, where they wanted to put their art on the same level as, say, French Renaissance paintings or Greco-Roman statuary, and really give it the respect that they deserved, and also to show primarily white audiences that this was a living culture, living art, and it needed to be not only preserved, but, promoted and celebrated.
How long did it take you to write your book?
It was a 2-year project, and I'll tell you the reason for that was this man, Eric Douglas, Poppy, he was born in 1897 and he died in 1956, so not a real long life. And he crammed so much into those few years with his work with the museum, with befriending these Native creators, and with really pioneering just a lot of what were considered at the time very innovative museum techniques that ended up, being sort of the model for the way we look at museum art today. And the 2-year period was just done by reading a lot of letters that he wrote that the Denver Art Museum has in their archives, and scanning things like my great-grandfather's 1921 diary that he kept when they went on a trip through the Four Corners region by mule train. And they did a lot of this exploration and contacting Native people through horseback and through, extended periods in the desert Southwest. And I'll give you one example that I thought was really interesting from this 1921 diary. Winfred Douglass, he was an Episcopalian priest and he specialized in music. That was really his calling in life. But he developed a lifelong fascination with Native cultures because he had a very serious health problem. And he took it upon himself to live among the Hopi people to try to get better. A lot of people came out west back in those days to help with lung problems, and he had that among other things. And he just was so enamored of their culture and their art. He learned to speak their language. He was fluent in Hopi. They made him a blood brother, called him Tall Pine Tree. And so when he took Eric on this trip in 1921, he wanted it to be a bonding experience between father and son. And he has these beautiful little diary entries, and a lot of them are pretty matter of fact, like today we rode so many miles, or we were looking for water in little, rock holes, or the sunset was beautiful. But then there was this one entry, and today we rescued a mule from a pine tree. And I read that and I said, what? How? How is that even possible? And so I looked throughout that whole diary, and that was it, just that one line. So I had to use my imagination to fill in the blanks about how the mule got in the pine tree and how they rescued him. And that was sort of the fun of that 2-year project, is finding these little bits and then extrapolating them to make what I hope is an entertaining novel that's all based on true events.
Everything in Poppy is rooted in truth, but you used your imagination to fill in the gaps. You probably already gave some examples of that, but can you give us a couple examples of that?
Yeah, you bet. The reason my grandfather got involved with the Denver Art Museum was at the urging of Ann Evans. And Ann Evans was the daughter of Colorado's second territorial governor, John Evans, who was quite infamously associated with the Sand Creek Massacre. He was the governor of Colorado when that happened. And so it is sort of my theory that Anne felt very guilty about, what happened at Sand Creek and her family's association with it. And so she, sort of like Eric and sort of like Eric's father, decided to try to, really champion these Native creators as well. And so she was the one that convinced him to join the Denver Art Museum. And so in my book, I have this imagined conversation between Anne and Poppy at their beautiful home in Evergreen that the Douglas family had, called Camp Neosho, which was set in a ponderosa pine grove. And it was made with all natural materials. And if any of your listeners ever come to Colorado, I'd like to recommend a trip up to Evergreen to visit what's called the Hiwan Heritage Park, because my family's home is preserved as a museum. At any rate, there is this imagined conversation between Anne and Eric about the need to try to do something about this art and bringing it to the public's attention. So that's one example where I used my imagination. There's another where Eric teamed up with another museum curator named Renee de Harnecourt. They did a beautiful exhibit in San Francisco in 1939 at what was essentially a World's Fair for the West Coast to celebrate the opening of the San Francisco and Oakland Bay bridges. And their role there was to create this Indian court, is what they called it, where they brought in, Native creators, live demonstrators to show, how do you make a pot? How do you weave a blanket? How do you do a sand painting? And so there was an episode, a true episode, in which one of the Native creators, a Southern Cheyenne named Mary Little Bear Inkanish, asked them if they could use the Indian court for a healing ceremony, because they knew of this little girl with polio, and she had a leg problem. And they wanted to combine the best of the white and Native worlds. A lot of people wanted this little girl to go to a hospital in San Francisco. but Mary Little Bear and some of her people wanted to try a sand painting, which was used to heal people. It's not just a piece of art. And so that really did happen. They shut down the whole Indian court so they could do this sacred ceremony. And Renee and Eric and Mary Little Bear and a few others were admitted to see this ceremony. So I had to use my imagination as to what that was probably like when they put the little girl and her mother on the sand painting and did this ceremony to try to heal her. So those are two examples.
Is it possible in today's era for one who is not Native American to celebrate Native American artwork without engaging in inappropriate cultural appropriation?
You know, I would like to think that it is possible today, and I think it was possible then as well. Eric Douglas took great pains to make sure that he was in partnership with these Native creators when he brought their work to the Denver Art Museum. And let's be specific, you know, he did pay for this artwork. He would seek out these top creators and make sure that they were paid and then got the recognition at the museum. As an example, he was very good friends with a Hopi potter named Nampeyo. And she lived in First Mesa, which is one of the centers of Hopi life in Arizona. And she was revered for trying to preserve the ancient way of making pottery that went back thousands of years. She would descend from her home on the mesa, you know, several hundred feet to the desert floor, and she would scrounge around for ancient design shards of, you know, pottery that had been there for centuries, so she could duplicate the designs and keep that culture going. And then Eric would, in turn, you know, take her work, put it in the museum, and then explain to visitors how, you know, Nampeyo was keeping this tradition alive. So I think at every step of the way, whether it was Denver or San Francisco or later New York, when he teamed up on another big exhibit involving Native creators, he tried to work in partnership with them. So I wouldn't say there was appropriation, but more of just, you know, I want to work with you on making sure that your stuff is out there, not just preserved or trapped under glass, but let's prove to these other audiences that you're still making this art. It's vital. And, you know, please support these artists. And I think that's true today. I think it was true 100 years ago.
I'm going to pivot back to your book for another question here. Is your book self-published, traditionally published, or published via hybrid press? And what was it like getting your book published?
It's definitely a self-published book. Like a lot of people these days, you know, I use KDP, and that process was really a lot easier than I expected. And I think my work as a broadcast journalist really helped because I spent most of my career, you know, editing other people's work and you know, helping them to be better writers. And so I kind of had to put that hat on myself when I put this together. But it was the hardest part, I think, was trying to put myself in the time frame that the book is set in, you know, in the late 1800s, you know, through the 1950s, and trying to find the right voices for the people involved, because again, they're real people. They're my grandfather, they're my great grandfather, they're my aunt, my mom. And so I really tried to, you know, just immerse myself in the culture of the period. You know, trying to find Native voices as a white person was very difficult, and so I tried not to delve too deeply into that. I don't want to offend anyone, but I did my best by reading transcripts of interviews with some of these creators and trying to find their voice that way. And I'm finding that this book is proving to be popular among, you know, people that love not only Colorado history but history in general, that appreciate the arts. And I've been very pleased with the response to this.
I'm going to ask one final question that I find interesting because there wasn't as anywhere near as much mental health awareness in your grandfather's time than nowadays, but how did your grandfather advocate for better mental health treatments of America's wounded warriors?
I'm so glad you asked that question because there was a significant part of my grandfather's life where he was in World War II. And because of his administrative experience at the Denver Art Museum, the Army Medical Corps realized he would make a great hospital administrator. And so he was sent to New Hebrides in the South Pacific with over 100 nurses to start a hospital there. And they did receive a lot of the frontline casualties. Many of them were what was known at the time as shell shock patients. Today we would probably refer to them as traumatic brain injury patients. And because of Eric's background in the arts and his love of classical music, which was passed on by his father, who was a musician, he realized that music could be therapy. And so he had a stack of classical records from composers, including the likes of Rachmaninoff, where he would play for these patients that had suffered terribly on the front lines and realized that it was helping them to come to some semblance of normalcy. He also organized choirs at this hospital of convalescing patients. And again, the power of the music to help with that brain treatment. And I'm very proud of the fact that he was one of the first ones to really experiment with that and see the healing effects of music.
Jack, you were an absolutely amazing guest, and I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. If I could do a shameless little plug here. Again, the book is called Poppy, A Colorful Colorado Life, and you can find it on Amazon or on my website, sandgoatmanorpublishing.com, and I'm sure you'll link it all up on your website. And thank you so much for the time today.
Jack's grandfather lived an interesting and wonderful life, and I enjoyed interviewing Jack about his book and his grandfather. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@ApolloPapyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.